My name is Christy Belton, and I'm the postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Dayton's Human Rights Center. On behalf of the Human Rights Center and the University of Dayton, I would like to extend a warm welcome to you. It is with great pleasure that we meet with you here today to take part in our second biennial Social Practice of Human Rights Conference. I have had the good fortune of working with a great team of human rights scholars and advocates here at the University of Dayton for more than a year now. It is my hope that over the next 2 days, you will come to see what makes this university such a special and supportive place for human rights education, scholarship, and advocacy. Many individuals came together over the course of the past year to make this conference a reality. We are grateful to them all, and you can find their names listed on the back of your program. I would, however, like to take a moment to extend a special thanks to a few individuals. Mark Ensalaco, Research Director of the Human Rights Center, Monty Moyer, who's somewhere around here as well, who's a Senior Administrative Assistant for the Center and the Hanley Sustainability Institute, and Yusuf Farhat, who's sitting over there in his suit. We see you. He's a Program Coordinator for the Center. They were a pleasure to work with, and this conference would not have taken place without our combined efforts. So thank you. As some of you may already know, our first Social Practice of Human Rights Conference brought together a wide array of scholars, advocates, and practitioners to engage in dialogue on the meaning of social practice when it comes to human rights advocacy. My friend and colleague, Joel Pruce, will be coming to the podium shortly to discuss the findings of this conference and the cutting-edge volume that resulted from it. This second conference, which is taking place a week after world leaders and heads of state adopted the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals, promises to be just as fruitful an endeavor. In his opening remarks to the General Assembly, United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon stated, and I quote, "The true test of commitment to Agenda 2030 will be implementation. We need action from everyone, everywhere," end quote. We are gathered here today to heed this call. Over the course of the next 2 days, we will discuss human rights issues that are both close to and far from home. We will examine our world's new global agenda and our role and stake in implementing it. This conference, then, as the first, is a meeting place of the minds. We think and talk about how we can best carry forward the torch of the human rights movement in our diverse fields. But it is, just as importantly, a space of action and a space for action. We are here to foment the transformation that the new Global Compact calls for. So let's share our ideas, voice our concerns, and offer suggestions. Let's be bold in our thoughts and decisive in our actions. Let's take the opportunity that this conference creates to take seriously Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon's proclamation that, I quote, "To do better, we must do differently," end quote. In the spirit of doing differently, I now have the pleasure of introducing Joel Pruce, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at the University of Dayton, who will set the stage for what it means to engage in the social practice of human rights. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Does this block the view if I... Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to address you at the outset of this exciting day of research presentations, which is a statement only a room full of nerds can truly appreciate. Thank you to Mark, to Christy, to Yusuf and Monty for all their work on the conference and for inviting me to share some thoughts with you this morning. 2 years ago, when we hosted the first Social Practice of Human Rights conference here at UD, the organizers, myself included, didn't have a real clear sense of what that phrase meant, the social practice of human rights. These were all words we recognized individually and could readily define. Shrunk together, it sounded clever, but what in the hell did it actually mean? Once the conference closed, I set out to articulate the concept in a chapter that framed a book containing research presented in 2013 that was published this past June by Palgrave Macmillan, and it's available for the bargain basement price of $100. In that paper, I describe what I see as a practice turn in human rights research that you all here this weekend capture nicely. A direction in human rights scholarship that takes as its subject the work of advocates and practitioners, not laws, not norms, not institutions, not states, not international organizations, not militaries, and not corporations, at least not exclusively. Investigating the social practice of human rights is an effort toward unpacking assumptions about strategies, motivations, and impacts, and exploring significant dilemmas raised in the process of translating global norms for various audiences and in diverse contexts. We can talk about norm diffusion, but norms don't just diffuse on their own. We can talk about monitoring and reporting, but these processes are not magical or natural. We can talk about implementation and compliance, but these behaviors do not occur automatically or without cause. Social practice research does not eschew laws or states, but it does expand the appropriate space for exploring how human rights matter in society, culture, and politics. Social practice is the performance of norms in lived experience, not in the sense that norms are diffused or learned, which, while significant, only stands in for real practices. Whether or not states comply with norms remains important, but practice involves the activities by which compliance occurs, the local transformations compliance brings about, and the pressure to maintain compliance. For human rights, social practice is the grind of giving corporeal form to ideas and values through the labor of actual people whose energies are directed at improving the lives of others. Studying advocacy through a social practice lens recommends we have something to say about the lived experiences of people in the world, both those confronting cruelty as well as those seeking to lend a hand. Social practice research places the activities of the human rights movement under a microscope by focusing on the points of contact where the work is done in all its gloriously mundane detail. These efforts often occur in discourse, in communication, translation, mediation, education, conversation, and interpretation. Social practice in these terms does not take place in front of a judge, in a legislature, or from behind a podium, because these arenas exist outside the reach of most of us. The social practice of human rights is a people's perspective on the methods and tools we've constructed for building power from below. But human rights is no longer a movement from below, suggesting a crucial component of the practice turn: the imperative for critique commensurate with the status of human rights advocacy. The practice turn in human rights research emerges at a moment when human rights is a mainstream framework for thinking about justice and equality, not the outsider, upstart, or insurgent it once was. Theoretically, human rights challenges power and checks its exercise. But what happens when power is contained within the human rights discourse and commonly championed by the very holders of power we seek to check? Human rights has surely arrived, but are we comfortable with the shape it's taken and the way its prominence determines its outlook? In its early years, we would say that survivors, their lawyers and family members, trade unionists, and religious groups galvanized the movement. By and large, communities constituted by individuals directly affected by political violence. For decades thereafter, the work of human rights practitioners was dismissed by politicians and ignored by scholars. Human rights work was characterized as a subcategory of a pithy humanitarianism, practiced by pot-smoking, hand-holding, kumbaya singing spiritualists dedicated to the cause out of faith and devotion alone. Today, human rights advocacy is a career pursued by serious people who attend top-tier graduate programs and upon graduation might otherwise find themselves in an elite law practice or climbing the ladder in the public sector. It is at this moment, and as a direct response to these developments, that critical human rights studies takes aim at the human rights movement for its growth, for its prowess, for its lofty aspirations and frequent disappointments. We've heard that human rights is both at its end times and its twilight for exactly these kinds of reasons. Critics argue that human rights advocates are, on the one hand, only out to dominate, as well as being not strong enough to matter at all. Human rights remains Western and Northern and has failed to adapt to the shifting nature of global politics. Human rights advocates are unduly beholden to funders, undemocratic and non-representative. Human rights has been co-opted by everyone from celebrities and corporations to belligerent armies and theocratic states. There's plenty of criticism to go around for sure, but the dictates of imminent critique demand that we hold a mirror up to the human rights movement and engage in scholarly inquiry that seeks to propose new, better ways forward in solidarity with practitioners. In this sense, scholar-practitioner cooperation is increasingly common as centers and institutes conduct work with a normative slant geared toward making demonstrable change. At the University of Dayton's Human Rights Center, we have initiated meaningful projects with NGO collaborators, including Catholic Relief Services and Pruce, Media for Social Justice, and also house an anti-trafficking organization, Abolition Ohio, within our walls. The social practice of human rights captures the overlap of work at the intersection of research and advocacy. Conducting research in this area permits academics to descend from their ivory towers and get their hands dirty in the practical world, practicing what we preach and participating as engaged partners and part of a broadly conceived human rights community. And this notion of community brings us to the final element of the practice turn, that is, the social part. When we speak of a human rights community, what do we refer to? In some sense, we think of a bounded group of actors held together by shared goals, identities, and values. Sometimes this means sharing resources and working together, but we also know that community members compete with one another over scarcity. We know, however, that ideas as often lead to friction as they do to harmony. Questions of origins and foundations plague human rights and evidence deep divides within this, quote, community. The community moniker is self-applied in the human rights context, which also suggests that human rights actors want to believe they are working with others collectively. But I would add to this list that communities are also constituted by their shared practices and habits. Think even of a community like the medical community, which develops knowledge on best practices to disseminate to members to improve overall outcomes. What makes the landscape of human rights hang together as a community is the convergence around practices engaged in by its constituents who believe themselves to be part of a community. While not necessarily standing shoulder to shoulder at every moment, members of communities of practice remain bound by a common cause, a set of overlapping interests, and a base of tactical wisdom developed through generations of trial and error. However, communities are not especially well known for their capacity for self-reflection. Quite the contrary. Communities are insular and inward-looking. Communities circle the wagons and protect their own. Isn't this, after all, why we create communities at all? For shelter and protection from the outside, to establish a division of labor, for bearing shared burden, for feeling as though we are greater than the sum of our parts. Communities are naturally conservative, myopic, and defensive, resistant to change, glacially slouching toward adaptation, and not particularly predisposed to introspection. Cultivating critique of communities provokes elites and members to lash out, to ostracize, and to rally around the center, which is why so often it is from the fringes and the margins of communities that calls for reform are first heard. Now, if there's one thing you probably don't know about me, it's that I was a high school wrestler, a skinny little guy with a dirty teenage mustache in one of those terrible skimpy outfits. How's that for an image in your head over breakfast? I wasn't a bad wrestler, though. I was sort of quick, and I could execute a handful of things. And I was 9-2 in my freshman year, a fact that I look forward to bragging about for the rest of my life and thinking of putting on my tombstone. And I raised this because I had a wrestling coach in high school named Glenn Pazinko. Great name, math teacher with a huge neck. Mr. Pazinko urged us, quite poetically, that practice does not make perfect, practice makes permanent. He insisted that when we drilled, our form was correct, so that we were building good habits, not just building habits. And this is true of practice generally, and more so of communities of practice, in which habits are developed over long periods of time, repeated endlessly, and ingrained deeply in our muscle memory. Scholars working within the social practice paradigm play a key role by exposing the human rights community to greater scrutiny, by peeking behind the curtain and letting in some light. By building collaborative relationships, researchers can be seen to be trustworthy critics and an essential source of tough love. In order to shake the human rights community from its complacency, to break it free from stagnant routines and tired rehearsals, to build a dynamic human rights community, it is beholden upon us to critique its practices and contribute in a meaningful way to move human rights protection forward. Thank you very much for being here this weekend. Thank you for your contribution to our dialogue. Enjoy your day. And from here, you are welcome, of course, to enjoy your coffee. And we are scheduled for our first panels at 8:45. And that's in 25 minutes. So we can relax, we can enjoy coffee and another half a bagel. Thanks very much.